Her body trembled as she desperately pulled away, her eyes wide with sheer terror. "Please, let go of me," she whispered, her voice tiar under the strain. The smug millionaire merely tightened his iron grip on her wrist, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Oh, come on. A little attention never hurts anyone." The opulent ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Waiters froze in their tracks. Wealthy guests turned to watch the terrified Maid struggle. But in that glaring silence, not a single person stepped forward to help. Except for one man. Watching from the shadows with a chilling, dead-eyed calm was no ordinary guest. It was Malik Draven. And behind his custom-tailored suit and billionaire status laid the most dangerous, untouchable mafia boss in the country. And the brutal lesson he was about to teach that entitled pervert is something no one in that room would ever forget. Stay with me until the end, because this story will shock you to the core. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. It's the height of the season at the Grand Starlight Hotel. The crystal chandeliers of the main ballroom cast a warm glow over a crowd of elite billionaires, politicians, and socialites mingling over expensive champagne. This wasn't just a party, it was a playground for the untouchable. In a place like this, everyone understood the unspoken rules. The wealthy took whatever they wanted, and the staff in their crisp uniforms remained completely invisible. Malik Draven stood near the grand staircase, nursing a single glass of bourbon. He was a man who exuded an aura of intense, hidden danger, the kind of quiet power that made even the most arrogant men in the room instinctively give him a wide berth. He had built an underground empire that controlled half the eastern seaboard, and his dark eyes missed absolutely nothing. This was how Malik survived. He was a ghost in high society. Cynical, detached, and utterly separated from the struggles of everyday people. He understood one fundamental truth about his dark world. Getting involved in public drama was a liability. But tonight, that cynical rule was about to be shattered. The Starlight Hotel was a monument to excess, a golden cage, where the bars were forged from 24-karat gold, and the floor was polished to a mirror shine that reflected the hollow smiles of the elite. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and perfumes that cost more than a year of Tracey Laporte's rent. For Tracey, this wasn't a fairy tale, it was a shift. Her back ached from hours of standing, and her hands, though steady as she balanced a silver tray of vintage champagne, were beginning to stiffen from the cold condensation of the glasses. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, trained to be seen but never noticed. It was a grueling dance of invisibility. She had to anticipate a guest's needs before they even realized them, yet she was expected to absorb their casual dismissals and cold stares without a flicker of emotion. To the billionaires in this room, she wasn't Tracey. She was simply the help, a necessary tool to ensure their evening remained seamless. She thought of her daughter waiting at home, the reason she pushed through the exhaustion, and the biting remarks of women who looked through her as if she were made of glass. In one corner, Martin Crowell sat surrounded by a circle of sycophants, his laughter loud and abrasive. He was the embodiment of the hotel's darkest side, a man born into so much wealth that he believed the world was his personal inventory. He watched Tracey move, his eyes tracking her with a predatory confidence that made the hair on her neck stand up. To Martin, the rules of the Starlight didn't apply. He didn't just want service, he wanted a display of his own power. Standing apart from the noise, Malik Draven watched the room with the calculated precision of a man who ruled an empire built on silence and steel. He saw the way the other patrons leaned into their entitlement, and he saw the flicker of genuine fear in Tracey's eyes as she approached Crowell's table. Malik lived by a code of detachment, believing that sentiment was a fatal flaw in his line of work. Yet, as he watched the smug millionaire prepare to make his move, the cold walls around Malik's heart felt a sudden, sharp pressure. He knew what was coming. He knew the cost of silence. And for the first time in years, the billionaire boss found himself choosing to look closely at a struggle he usually would have ignored. The air around Martin Crowell's table was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive scotch and unearned arrogance. As Tracey approached to clear a stray glass, she felt his gaze, sharp, cold, and heavy with a sense of ownership that made her skin crawl. She kept her eyes down, her movements robotic and precise, hoping to remain the invisible servant the hotel demanded she be. But Martin had no intention of letting her fade into the background. Before she could retract her hand from the table, his fingers snapped shut around her wrist like a trap. The sudden, cold contact sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. Tracey gasped, her silver tray wobbling as she instinctively tried to pull back. "Sir, please," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the noisy room. Martin didn't let go. Instead, he leaned back, his smug smile widening as he felt her struggle. He looked at her not as a person, but as a curiosity, a subordinate to be toyed with for the entertainment of his laughing friends. "Where are you going so fast?" Martin asked, his voice dripping with a sickening, honeyed entitlement. "I haven't finished my conversation with you." He pulled her closer, forcing her to lean awkwardly over the table, her shoulder tensing in a desperate attempt to create distance. The grip on her wrist was firm, a silent declaration that in this room, his money was the only law that mattered. Tracey's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked around the circle of onlookers, her eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to speak up, to tell him to stop, to acknowledge her humanity. But the wealthy guests simply watched, their expressions ranging from amused to bored. To them, this was just another minor disruption in an evening of excess. Martin's confidence grew with every second of silence from the crowd. He felt invincible, draped in the protection of his status, convinced that he could cross any line without consequence. He began to pull her wrist toward his lap, his laughter joining the cacophony of the ballroom. Tracey's breath came in shallow, jagged hitches as she realized that in this golden cage, the only thing more dangerous than the predators were the people who watched them feed. She felt her strength failing, her hope dimming, until a sudden, heavy silence began to ripple outward from the center of the room, starting from the shadow where Malik Draven stood. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a heavy, suffocating complicity. Tracey's silver tray finally slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the thick carpet with a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than a gunshot. Champagne pooled into the rug like a weeping wound, but no one moved to help her. Martin Crowell's grip remained unyielding, his knuckles white against her skin, a stark contrast to the dark, terrified trembling of her own hand. She looked toward a couple she had served just an hour prior, a senator and his wife who had praised her excellent attention to detail. Now, they carefully adjusted their silk napkins and looked toward the orchestra, their eyes glazed over with a sudden, convenient fascination for the decor. To her left, a group of young socialites whispered behind their manicured hands, their faces twisted in a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, as if they were watching a scene in a movie rather than a human being in distress. Tracey felt the heat of humiliation rising in her chest, more painful than the physical pinch on her wrist. The bystander effect had turned the room into a gallery of statues. Each guest was waiting for someone else to be the hero, calculating the social cost of offending a man with Martin's connections. Their inaction was a loud, clear message. She was an outsider, a background character in their lives whose suffering was an inconvenient smudge on their perfect evening. "Is there a problem here?" a floor manager finally approached, but his voice lacked conviction. He didn't look at Martin's hand. He looked at the spilled champagne. "Tracey, clean this up immediately. You're causing a scene." The unfairness of it nearly broke her. Martin chuckled, emboldened by the manager's spinelessness. "You heard the man, sweetheart. Clean it up. But don't think you're going anywhere until I say so." He gave her arm a sharp, possessive jerk that forced her to stumble toward him. Tracey's eyes filled with tears of frustration. She realized then that in this room of 100 powerful people, she was utterly alone. The world was a place where the loud and the wealthy could crush the quiet and the working, and the rest of society would simply watch the spectacle. But then, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A shadow stretched across the table, long and jagged, cutting through the golden light. It was a presence that didn't just walk into the space, it occupied it, demanding a silence so absolute that even the distant clink of silver in the kitchen seemed to die away. Malik Draven had left the shadows, and the air around Martin Crowell was about to become very thin. The transition was not a sudden movement, but a shift in the room's very atmosphere, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the gilded ballroom. Malik Draven set his glass of bourbon down on a passing waiter's tray with a deliberate, haunting quietness. He didn't rush. A man like Malik never had to. Each step he took across the marble floor resonated with a weight that seemed to vibrate through the soles of the onlookers' shoes. The whispers died in throats. The senator lowered his gaze. Even the music from the orchestra seemed to falter, the violins thinning out into a nervous hum. Malik moved through the crowd like a wolf through a flock of panicked sheep. People instinctively parted, their bodies leaning away from the sheer, cold radiation of his presence. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't need their permission. His focus was locked on the table where Martin Crowell still held Tracey's wrist, a grip that now looked increasingly like a death sentence. When Malik reached the table, he didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, a towering silhouette of tailored charcoal wool and tempered steel. The shadow he cast fell directly over Martin's face, dousing the man's smug expression in darkness. For a heartbeat, Martin tried to maintain his smirk, looking up with a defiant tilt of his chin, but his bravado withered the moment he met Malik's eyes. They were eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires, eyes that held no mercy for the small-minded cruelty of bullies. "The lady is trembling," Malik said. His voice was a low, melodic growl that carried to every corner of the silent room. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of a crime. Martin swallowed hard, his fingers twitching against Tracey's skin, but he didn't let go yet. He was a man used to being the most important person in any room, and his ego was struggling to process the sudden, overwhelming threat. "This is none of your business, pal. She made a mess, and I'm just—" "You are breathing the same air as me," Malik interrupted, his tone chillingly conversational as he leaned in closer. "And right now, that is a privilege I am reconsidering. Let her go." The authority in those 3 words was absolute. It wasn't just a command, it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Tracey looked up, her tear-stained face reflecting a new kind of shock. She had expected a miracle, but she hadn't expected the storm. As Malik's hand moved toward the table, the air grew even thinner, and the world waited to see just how far the billionaire boss would go to break the man who thought he was untouchable. The air around the table didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy, as if the very molecules had solidified into a wall of impending violence. Martin Crowell looked up into Malik's eyes, and for a fleeting second, the entitlement that had shielded him his entire life began to crumble. His fingers, however, remained locked around Tracey's wrist, a final, desperate anchor to his fading sense of control. He tried to speak, to assert his status, but his voice came out as a pathetic, dry rasp. "Do you have any idea who my father is?" Malik didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out, his hand moving with a predatory grace that was almost too fast to follow. He didn't grab Martin, he simply placed a single, firm hand over Martin's forearm. The contact was light, yet the implication was tectonic. Malik leaned in, his lips inches from Martin's ear, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. "I don't care about your father. But if you don't release this woman in the next heartbeat, I will ensure he spends the rest of his life mourning a son who didn't know when to keep his hands to himself." The threat was so quiet, so intimate, that only the 3 of them could hear it, but the sheer malice behind it was unmistakable. Martin's eyes bulged, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Slowly, his fingers began to tremble, losing their strength. Malik applied the slightest pressure to a nerve cluster in Martin's arm, a calculated movement that sent a jolt of numbing pain through the man's limb. With a muffled cry of shock, Martin's hand snapped open. Tracey stumbled back, clutching her bruised wrist to her chest, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She looked at Malik, her eyes searching for the monster the room feared, but found only a strange, granite-like protection. Malik didn't look at her yet. His hand remained on Martin's arm, anchoring the man to his chair. Martin tried to pull away, but it was like trying to move a mountain. "The lady is leaving now," Malik stated, his eyes never leaving Martin's. "And you are going to sit here, perfectly still, and think about the exact moment your life started to fall apart. Because that moment is now." Malik finally released him, and Martin collapsed back into his seat, his arm hanging limp and useless at his side. The crowd, finally finding their breath, began to murmur, but one look from Malik silenced them again. He turned to Tracey, his expression softening by a fraction, a minute crack in the billionaire's armor. The grip had been broken, the physical battle won, but as Malik motioned for her to follow him, the room understood that the real destruction of Martin Crowell was only just beginning. The silence in the ballroom was brittle, a thin sheet of glass waiting for the first hammer blow. Martin Crowell, clutching his throbbing arm, looked around at the faces of his peers. He saw their hesitation, their shock, and in his twisted mind, he mistook their silence for a lack of support. His ego, bloated by years of consequence-free cruelty, surged back with a vengeance. He scrambled to his feet, his face flushed a deep, ugly crimson as he pointed a trembling finger at Malik Draven's back. "You think you can just walk in here and touch me?" Martin's voice went from a rasp to a panicked shriek that cracked against the high ceilings. "Do you have any idea who I am? My family bankrolls half the politicians in this city. I'll have your business shuttered by morning. I'll have the police at your door before you can even get to your car." Malik stopped. He didn't turn around immediately, but the very air seemed to thicken around him. Beside him, Tracey flinched, her eyes darting toward the security guards who were now hovering at the edges of the room, unsure of which billionaire to protect. Martin, emboldened by Malik's stillness, took a staggering step forward, his chest heaving. "I'm talking to you. You're finished. I'll see you for everything you're worth. I'll make sure you're begging for scraps on the street alongside this little maid." A few guests gasped at the sheer venom in Martin's voice, but Malik simply tilted his head, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only the promise of an ending. Slowly, he turned to face the younger man. The look in Malik's eyes wasn't anger, it was the clinical boredom of a predator watching a trapped rabbit scream. "You speak of money as if it's a shield," Malik said, his voice terrifyingly calm, cutting through Martin's hysteria like a razor through silk. "You speak of your father's connections as if they are iron. But you've made a fundamental error, Martin. You've mistaken my silence for a lack of resources." Malik reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He didn't look at the screen as his thumb moved with practiced ease. "By all means, call your father. Tell him you laid hands on a woman under my roof. Tell him you threatened Malik Draven in public." He paused, his gaze locking onto Martin's widening pupils. "But do it quickly. Because in exactly 60 seconds, the name Crowell will be a liability that no bank in this country will touch." Martin's mouth hung open, his threats dying in his throat. The confidence that had fueled his outburst vanished, replaced by a cold, sinking realization. He had walked into a trap of his own making, and the man standing before him wasn't just a billionaire. He was the architect of the very world Martin thought he owned. The phone in Malik's hand didn't even seem to ring. The connection was instantaneous, as if his empire had been holding its breath, waiting for his command. Malik didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at the screen. He kept his eyes locked on Martin, watching as the younger man's chest hitched in shallow, panicked bursts. "It's me," Malik said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the heart. "Crowell Holdings. Liquidate the short positions. Contact their primary creditors and inform them that their collateral is no longer recognized by the Draven Group. And call the district attorney's office. I believe they have a file on Martin's private parties that needs to be moved to the top of the pile." He paused, a ghost of a cold smile flickering on his lips. "Do it now. I want the name erased before I finish my drink." He ended the call with a deliberate click that sounded like a gavel hitting a block. For a moment, nothing happened. The ballroom remained trapped in its gilded silence. Then a sudden chorus of digital chirps and vibrations began to erupt from the pockets of the elite guests surrounding them. One by one, men in expensive suits pulled out their phones, their faces paling as they read the breaking news alerts and urgent internal memos. The contagion of Malik's influence was spreading at the speed of light. Across the city, servers were humming, wire transfers were being frozen, and decades of the Crowell family's carefully built prestige were being dismantled by invisible hands. Martin's own phone began to buzz incessantly in his pocket, a frantic, rhythmic pleading from his father. "What did you do?" Martin whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He pulled out his phone, his thumb shaking as he swiped across the screen. His eyes widened, reflecting the blue light of a dozen notifications. His personal credit lines revoked. His trust fund frozen under investigation. Even his social media accounts were blinking out of existence as the PR firm scrambled to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Malik stepped closer, his shadow completely consuming the smaller man. "I didn't do anything, Martin. You did this. You thought you were playing a game with a maid. You didn't realize you were betting your entire life against a man who owns the table." Tracey watched, her breath catching as she witnessed the terrifying efficiency of Malik's world. It wasn't just a display of wealth, it was the awakening of an empire. In less than 60 seconds, the smug predator who had gripped her wrist had been stripped of his fangs, his armor, and his name. Martin looked up, tears of genuine terror finally spilling over, but Malik had already turned away. To the Mafia Boss, the destruction was already a memory. The destruction was not a slow decay. It was a high-speed collision with reality. Martin Crowell stood in the center of the ballroom, his expensive silk tie suddenly feeling like a noose. His phone transformed into a weapon of psychological warfare, vibrating with a relentless rhythm that signaled the total collapse of his world. Each notification was a fresh blow to his soul. A text from his father's lead counsel, "Don't come home. The feds are at the estate." An email from the board of his family's charitable foundation, "Your membership has been terminated effective immediately." Across the room, the very people who had shared a laugh with him moments ago now looked at him with a mixture of horror and disgust. They didn't just step away, they retreated as if he were carrying a plague. The senator who had been eyeing a seat on his father's board turned his back entirely, engrossed in a sudden, urgent conversation with a potted palm. The socialites who had whispered behind their hands now openly sneered, their loyalty to the Crowell name evaporating the second that name lost its currency. Martin was watching his entire identity, built on the pillars of inherited wealth and unearned respect, vanish in the span of a few heartbeats. He tried to scream, to demand that the hotel security remove Malik, but the guards stood like statues, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor. They knew who Malik Draven was. They knew that in this moment, the man in the charcoal suit held more power than the hotel, the city, and the law combined. Martin fell to his knees, his phone slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the marble. The screen stayed lit, displaying a final, devastating alert. The primary bank of the Crowell Empire had just filed for emergency restructuring. The fall of his arrogance was complete. The smug, confident predator who had grabbed Tracey's wrist was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man who realized, too late, that his power had always been an illusion. He looked up at the crystal chandeliers, the golden cage that had once been his playground, and saw only the bars. He was no longer the master of the house. He was a trespasser in a world that had already forgotten his name. As Malik began to lead Tracey toward the exit, his hand light but firm on her shoulder, they walked past the kneeling, broken figure of Martin Crowell. Malik didn't offer a final word or a parting glance. To him, Martin was already a ghost, a minor footnote in a much larger story of justice. The room remained silent, the only sound the distant, mournful siren of a police car approaching the hotel, signaling that the nightmare for the Crowell family was only just beginning. The cool night air of the city felt like a benediction as Malik led Tracey away from the suffocating opulence of the Starlight Hotel. Behind them, the ballroom was a scene of whispered chaos and falling empires, but here, Under the soft glow of the streetlights, the world felt momentarily still. Tracey walked with her head bowed, her hand still instinctively hovering over her bruised wrist. The adrenaline that had sustained her during the confrontation was fading, replaced by a trembling exhaustion and the terrifying realization of what she had just witnessed. Malik stopped beside his black sedan, his silhouette sharp against the city skyline. He didn't look at her with the cold detachment he usually reserved for the world. Instead, his gaze was steady, holding a quiet gravity that commanded her attention. "Tracey," he said, his voice no longer the growl of a predator, but the firm assurance of a guardian. "The Starlight is no longer a place for you. Men like Crowell are weeds. They are easily pulled, but the garden is still theirs. You deserve a life where your dignity isn't a luxury you have to fight for." Tracey looked up, her eyes wet with lingering tears. "I have a daughter, Mr. Draven. I needed the job." "You have more than a job now," Malik replied, opening the car door for her, a gesture of respect that no billionaire in that ballroom would have ever offered a maid. "You have my word. Starting tomorrow, you will manage the administrative offices of my charitable foundation. You will be compensated for your worth, not your invisibility. And more importantly, you will be under my personal protection. No one will ever lay a hand on you again." The weight that had been crushing Tracey's chest for years finally began to lift. It wasn't just the promise of money or safety, it was the feeling of being seen, of being human. She nodded, a small, tentative smile touching her lips for the first time. As the car pulled away, she looked back at the hotel, the golden cage, shrinking in the distance. Malik watched the city lights blur past the window. For 30 years, he had believed that power was a tool for survival, a weapon to be kept sharp and cold. But tonight, as he saw the hope in Tracey's reflection, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since he was a young man, a sense of justice. He hadn't just destroyed a bully, he had reclaimed a piece of his own soul. The most dangerous man in the city had discovered that the greatest use of his shadow wasn't to hide, but to provide a place of rest for those who had been standing too long in the heat. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more incredible stories that prove humanity still exists in the darkest places. Sometimes, the most shocking thing a powerful man can do is choose to be kind.